Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about Ego and Archetype by Edward Edinger. Many people regard Edinger as probably the most salient, effective, and easy to understand teachers of Jung's process of individuation. If you've ever read Carl Jung, you know he's tough. Edward Edinger makes that process a little bit more clear and understandable. So let's start with a quote and then we'll dive into it. Such themes as wholeness, totality, the union of opposites, the central generative point, the world navel, the axis of the universe, the elixir of life, all refer to the self, the central source of life energy, the fountain of our being, which is the most simply described as God. Edward Edinger. So this basic idea that the self is the world navel, the center of the circle, or the circle around the center, is a very fascinating point. The self is what Jung says unifies the conscious and unconscious psyche. Edward Edinger states that there are two centers of human consciousness. There's the ego, and then there's the self. The self is a higher psychological reality within human consciousness. It is the regulating principle of the psyche, the thing that circles around the conscious and unconscious. When this self erupts into an individual's life, certain processes are activated in the instinctual patterns of the psyche. An individual opens herself up to the collective unconscious. There are archetypes that reside in this realm of the psyche, and these forms give shape to the perceptions of the individual. When the self intrudes and makes itself known to the ego, it starts the individual in the process of individuation, which involves making the unconscious in oneself conscious. This self shapes the thoughts and behaviors of the individual. It depends on the rise of personality. If not handled properly, the manifestations of the self could result in psychosis for the individual, like it did for me. This is when the conscious ego is overwhelmed by the self, when the ego identifies itself as the self, which is ultimately false. The self is not something that you can simply access voluntarily. It bubbles up from the instinctual unconscious of mankind. So this is what Edinger essentially says. That first quote was him and the rest of that passage was me. But yeah, that's just what I wanted to point out, is this idea that the ego develops out of the human unconscious, and the ego is essentially a false entity. So yeah, I just wanted to get to that little part and speak to that little part of Ego and Archetype. The book itself is much more expansive than what I've just covered. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope you get into the book. Thank you.